everyone, and welcome to episode 30 of What to Think, the technology news podcast from VentureBeat.com. My name is Dylan Tweeney.
And I'm Jordan Ovett.
And has it really been 30 episodes since we started doing this? That's amazing. That's more than half a year.
Wow.
Today we're going to be talking to Jonathan Rosenberg, the co-author of How Google Works. He wrote that together with Google chairman and former CEO Eric Schmidt, and I am really looking forward to finding out how exactly Google works. So we'll come to that later. But first, let's talk about some tech news highlights from VentureBeat.com. Let's start with net neutrality and crappy broadband. Our writer, Chris O'Brien, who is stationed in lovely Toulouse in France, wrote a story about a week ago talking about how France has taught him that Americans are suckers who have only themselves to blame for their crappy, slow broadband speeds. And what set this off was that he is paying, I think, less than half of what he was paying in the U.S. for telecoms. He's paying the equivalent of $83 a month. In the U.S., in the Bay Area, he was paying $229 a month.
Actually, he was $63 a month. That's what he was paying.
Oh, 63.
Even lower than 83.
63 just for the wireline stuff. And he's getting 100 megabits per second of download speed, 250 cable channels, a home telephone with unlimited international calling, and a mobile phone that includes unlimited minutes and 3 gigabytes of data usage each month. I mean, he's getting way more. And like many people in France, the broadband is much broader. There's a lot more data. And his conclusion is essentially that the reason this has come about is because there's a lot of vigorous competition among broadband providers in France. There are many different providers. People have choices between Orange and others. Whereas in the US, because of the failure, Chris says, of regulators to actually enhance and allow competition, in the US, almost every cable market is a virtual, if not a complete monopoly. And therefore, you have basically one choice about where to get your internet if you want fast internet. Mm-hmm. So that's a problem. I picked up the thread on that and wrote about net neutrality, which we talked about last week on this podcast. And a lot of people are saying that net neutrality now needs to be enforced by the FCC, and I happen to agree. I think that our regulatory framework is a mess as far as it goes in regulating the internet. The laws that govern the internet, the Communications Act of 1934 was written, 40 years before there was an internet, essentially. And they're way out of date, but they're the best we have for now. And I think the FCC has an obligation to step in and provide some incentive for competition. And
apparently not everyone agrees with you, namely Mark Cuban.
He let me have it.
What did he tell you?
Mark Cuban let me have it. He sent me an email after I published my column, and he asked, so fine, you say you want equal access, but what are your principles for defining what equal access is? And what will those principles be in 3 years or 10 years when the tech is completely different? And then he also said, ask your author in France what taxes are like there and what it's like to try to start an internet company in France.
Look at the taxes.
Oh, yeah. The French do pay a lot of taxes. I will tell you a story. When I was in Paris last summer, I was riding around in a car, probably an Uber car, with a couple of venture capitalists, and they were complaining about the excessive regulation and the really high rates of taxation in Paris. Okay. And then at one point, without breaking the stride, one of them turned and he looked over at Versailles or something. He's like, man, the government has really built some amazing, beautiful structures, hasn't it? And then he went on with a conversation about how high taxes are in France. And I was like, you just didn't really make that connection, did you? Which is that it was years of oppressively high taxation, yes, which led to the French Revolution, but which also allowed the government to create Versailles. I'm not saying we need Louis XVI levels of concentration of government power and taxation, but there's a reason taxes are high in France. It's because the government is providing services like healthcare that we don't have in the U.S.
And man, I am just so jealous, though, of those rates. Maybe I should move to France.
The broadband rates, yes. Mark Cuban went on to say that, you can't regulate businesses. If the networks screw up, you should be able to nail them for screwing up and favoring, say, Hulu over Netflix or what have you. But he says you shouldn't proactively regulate. I'm not sure I agree with him. I still think we need net neutrality. But, Mark Cuban is entitled to his opinion, and he has a lot of listeners. Let's move on to another topic. Amazon's new Lambda cloud service. It's a huge deal for Jordan. A huge deal for devs.
It's also a huge deal for me.
A huge deal for Jordan, too. Tell us why Lambda is such a big deal, Jordan.
Okay, so Amazon Web Services, right? They're the number one cloud.
They absolutely are.
Okay. they have gotten people used to all these different kinds of computing services in Amazon Web Services. And there's a lot of knobs to turn, a lot of things that you can configure on Amazon Web Services. And people have largely gotten used to that. And so what Lambda does is say, we're going to abstract away all that complexity, and we're going to start using certain instances of servers for you and stop using them for you. All you have to do is give us the instruction booklet for your application, and we'll take care of running the infrastructure in order to make your application possible.
Is this like a recipe? Like you give Amazon a recipe and it creates something that meets your needs for your application?
Sort of. Let me give you an example. I was reading the Lambda page, and I came across this and said, you know what, this is a good example that I should include in the article. When an end user of an application uploads a new image for persistent storage on Amazon, like in...
I have a photo app or something.
Right. In one service, Lambda can ensure that the metadata for that picture gets stored in a database that can be queried later and searched later. And so it does all these things once you tell it what to do. And basically, it kind of cannibalizes the quote-unquote old school EC2 compute service that got Amazon started in the first place.
So what you're saying is developers who want to build software that runs on Amazon's cloud need to know less and less about the underpinnings of that cloud. It will just assemble things for them.
Yeah, and there's some irony here. One person who described it to me mentioned that, yes, it does use Node.js, the server-side JavaScript framework that we have written a lot about.
Quite a bit.
And he said it's Node meets if this, then that as a service. And that was a shortcut for saying that it does if this, then that style recipes or functions.
For those of you who don't know, if this, then that is really cool. I'm a huge fan. It's a simple service for sort of almost through drag and drop, lets you assemble little recipes to do things like if Jordan tweets something,
send me an email.
Send me an email. Yeah, exactly. Or save it in my Evernote on Jordan file.
And this is like across cloud infrastructure. It's way more complicated. And so this is infrastructure as a service. A simpler version of a cloud for building an application is called platform as a service. It scales up the infrastructure that you need in order to do the job that you want the application to do.
Yes.
And so platform as a service clouds never really hit the big time in terms of how much money they could bring in. And at the same time, it did abstract away the details of configuration. And so one person, Todd Hoff, summarized Lambda as PaaS++. Basically saying it's sort of kind of like PaaS, except that it deals in instructions of, how can I explain this well? It does more.
It does more. Okay. So the bottom line is PaaS hasn't really taken off, but maybe it will now because Amazon itself is providing that platform layer that lets you not have to worry about the infrastructure layer underneath that. Okay. I think we will have to wait and see what developers think about this.
I will tell you, no other cloud will come up with it for any span of time close to this, and that's why you need to keep a new eye on Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yet another reason to fear and respect Amazon in the cloud world. Let's just do one quick news item after this before we go to our guest. I'm sort of fond of this one because I think it just tells you something. Snapchat has formed a partnership with Square to launch something called Snapcash.
How does this work?
As you might think, well, basically, you can use Snapchat to send money to your friends.
And how do you get those Snapcash dollars?
You have to have a Visa or a MasterCard debit card. Once you enter the debit card into Snapchat, then Square stores the data and it does the payment processing. And so then you can send money to your friends in Snapchat.
And what's the exchange rate?
I don't know what the exchange rate is.
Okay. So you get Snap dollars, Snapcash.
Right. And I think this is interesting because it's actually a useful thing you're doing in Snapchat instead of sending pictures.
For what? Why would you need money in Snapchat?
Well, I started thinking about that, Jordan, and I think I have the perfect use case.
Okay.
Because I'm not going to send you $5 in Snapchat, probably, unless we're splitting a bar tab or something, right? Maybe we do that. But you know what? I think the real business case is nudie pictures.
Are you talking about pornography?
Yes, exactly. Somebody sends me $5 in Snapcash, and I will send them a picture. They'd have to, they wouldn't do that with me. But they might send somebody Snapcash in exchange for pictures of that person with their shirt off.
Are there going to be
clothes off.
Playboy.com nudie
I do not know. All I
accounts?
know is that Snapcash exists and that you can send money to your friends on Snapchat. How people use that, I'm sure that's up to them, and I'm sure that's the line that Snapchat is going to take as well.
I want to write the story about the first person to get rich quick on Snapcash.
Snapcash porn. You get out there and get that story, Jordan. I want to hear that too. And when you write that story, those of you out in podcast land, you know where to find it. It'll be on VentureBeat.com.
Damn right.
All right. Before we go to our guest, I'd like to take a minute to thank the host and sponsor of this podcast, New Relic. Now, New Relic is a software analytics company that makes sense of billions of data points about millions of applications in real time. It is a SaaS-based software analytics platform that empowers developers, IT people, and business leaders to transform their businesses by using data that comes directly out of production software. And New Relic also has a lovely office with this nice studio in it that we do our podcast recording in every week. Now I'd like to welcome our guest, Jonathan Rosenberg. He joined Google in 2002 and managed the design and development of many of the company's products, including Search, Ads, Gmail, Android, and Chrome. And he's the co-author of a book with Google former CEO and current chairman, Eric Schmidt. The book is called How Google Works, and I am looking forward to finding out exactly that. Welcome to What to Think, Jonathan.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
My first question is, you're not just like the typical CEO hires a ghostwriter kind of guy. Like you were there, like actually building a lot of these things, right, for a long time. So this is like sort of the two of you telling the story of how Google was built in a lot of ways. Give me a salient takeaway from the book. Like what, will I be able to recreate the magic with my own startup?
Well, we certainly hope you can. I think that, as you mentioned, the book is really the lessons that Eric and I learned from our front row seats managing at Google over the last 13 years. I think fundamentally, we believe this was a period where technology completely transformed virtually every business sector, and it forced us to adopt a new way of thinking about how to run and how to manage organizations. And whenever I had a chance in the management team meetings, when somebody came up with a new managementism, like Eric often did with his rules, repetition doesn't spoil the prayer, or focus on the user, I would write down the rules, and eventually we realized that it would make a good book.
One thing that struck me, Jonathan, is that you say you have a totally different management style from the style that you might have learned about in an MBA program, or the kind of program that IBM would use to have products come out all the time. What is the management style that was honed over the years that stands out so much from management styles that already are in existence and used arguably too much around the world?
Well, I think traditional management styles were really developed in an era over the course of the 20th century when information flowed from the top down and mistakes were very expensive. And so the product development cycle was one of gates where management would slowly release more resources against an idea as the idea went through the development process. And I think what we've learned is that in the online world, things move much more quickly. But in addition, the inputs that go into a traditional production function are becoming free and cheap and ubiquitous: information, connectivity, and computing power.
So Google has kind of embraced that, and you can see it in the outputs too, right? In that Google creates lots of new things. It's not exactly like throwing spaghetti on the wall to see what sticks, but it's closer to that than it is to the sort of Apple, like we're going to release nothing until it's a perfectly crafted jewel of a thing.
Well, yeah, I think ours is more of a iterate approach.
Yeah.
If you were to contrast it with Apple's. Much of the evolution of Google began with the notion that we had all sorts of data about what our users did online. So we were able to do a lot of A/B testing and iterating forward on the basis of our experience and the data that users shared with us by using our products.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I found interesting is that you don't like to devote a lot of marketing and PR resources toward a product that's very new. It seems like there was optimization for launching a product and then seeing the positive response, as opposed to launching a big product with a big hurrah and then finding out that it's a dud. Can you talk about some examples of that?
Sure. One of the things that I really learned coming from Excite at Home, where I managed the broadband portal, was the notion that in the online world, you really need to feed your winners and starve your losers. Mm-hmm. And this came across to me when I saw the way Marissa really manage the allocation of resources at Google, what I realized I had been doing in my previous job was we would define at the beginning of the quarter goals for the jobs area on the page, or the finance area on the page, or the careers section. And the one that was doing poorly, we would try to move to the top to get more page views. And that was exactly the wrong thing. We were putting the lousy products in front of our users as opposed to the really good ones. So one of the principles that we developed at Google was that we try to introduce products and see whether or not they're organically gaining traction. If organically they're gaining traction, then we can declare them winners, and we can start feeding them more marketing oomph, something you certainly noticed that we did with, say, Chrome. But we try to avoid feeding a product unless it's already started to garner significant growth by virtue of its functionality and users migrating towards it.
Now, the flip side of that is that you sometimes have to kill things, right, when they don't work out, whether that's something that just never took off, like, I suppose, Google Buzz, or something that might be popular but doesn't fit in with Google's overall strategy, like Reader. Is there a cost to that? Because I know sometimes people have their little pet products and they get sad when those go away.
Sure, and we've certainly had a number of products that we've had to kill. Wave is probably another pretty significant example of an effort that we had to kill. One of the things that we try to do is learn from all of those misfires and try to figure out how to integrate that functionality into new products as they evolve. Many of them are kind of narrow point solutions that ultimately manifest themselves in the form of functionality in another product in a more integrated and better way.
Like Google Plus.
Google Plus is an example of something, certainly evolving, actually incorporates some functionality of other products that have failed along the way.
Right.
And we try to be very transparent with people and give them a heads up significantly in advance if we're actually going to make one of the existing products obsolete.
At Google I/O this year, there was very little visibility into new developments on Google+. And I said, hey, whatever happened to Google+ after that? And I got an answer that has the marks of what you're saying, which is we're starting to use it as a social layer across the company. And I think actually you in your book talk about using Google+ in that way from the very beginning, but it seems that there is less prominence, there is less new product development for Google+. Do you think that falls anywhere near the category of product failures outright?
No, I don't. I think that Google+ still represents the social layer that stitches together many products across Google. If you look at a lot of the work that we did in getting the word out and marketing our book, both Eric and I have been using Google+ quite aggressively over the course of the last couple of months.
As Googlers do, right?
As many Googlers do, yeah. And in the final chapter of the book, we actually talk about the approach that Vic, as a smart creative, was a good example of when he sort of brought his vision for Google+ to the company, much of which I think has come to fruition and works very well.
You mentioned Vic, and you're referring to Vic Condotra, who is until recently running Google+. But he's no longer at Google, right? He left. I think a lot of people would sort of regard his departure as connected to Google+ not doing as well as perhaps the company had hoped. Do you have a comment on that, or do you think that Google+ is still following the course that he charted out?
I think it is largely following a course that he charted out. I don't personally know much about the specifics of his departure.
Okay. One thing that was really cool that I would like to see implemented at any company I work at is this spirit of innovation, this innovative ooze, or something about ooze that you write about.
Primordial ooze.
Primordial, thank you. Where employees feel empowered to do things that they're genuinely interested in and maybe departs a little bit from their primary responsibilities. How have you seen that adopted in companies other than Google? I mean, you say in the early parts of the book that you want to see these concepts implemented at companies small and large. And I wonder how easy or hard it is to do this primordial ooze stuff outside of a company that has its amazing roots that you document like Google.
I think it's very hard. And I think one of the reasons that we sort of wanted to write the book was to sort of give people the principles that we hold to be self-evident about how to try to follow through on a bunch of these things. I think you see a lot of companies doing the kind of traditional suggestion box type approach to innovation. You see lots of companies getting frustrated with their innovation, so they anoint someone as the chief of innovation. And we really believe that that kind of a model doesn't work. You need to really infuse the culture of innovation into all of the people in the company. One of the things that you need to do is make it okay to fail. management needs to discuss its mistakes. Management needs to set very, very big and exciting objectives. Larry often calls them moonshots. Mm-hmm. And when people don't achieve those objectives, something that they learn along the way actually becomes an innovation that manifests itself in functionality that actually comes to fruition.
Can you give us an example of that, where sort of a failure was turned into something that...
Astro Teller's favorite example of this is when he talks about the objectives that he was given for a car. You can give someone an objective to develop a car that gets 70 miles per gallon, or you can give them an objective to build a car that gets 500 miles per gallon. Mm-hmm. And if you give them the latter objective, then they're much more likely to come up with something that's actually useful. I think, for example, we saw that when we originally developed Gmail. I remember much of the vision of what we were going to accomplish initially is closer to the kind of priority inbox and functionality that we have today. But initially, it simply became a much better browser-based product that gave you an enormous amount of storage for email.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One question I have is whether Google X sort of functions as a chief innovation officer or separate division where there is amazing amounts of wild development of products. And I wonder how much people can go back and forth inside of Google to there or have the spirit of innovation tattooed on their chests, where they're anointed with the responsibility of innovating, rather than having a separate division of people who come up with special contact lenses and wild ideas like that.
I think we did try to create Google X in a way that there was the ability for individuals to come up with grand visions technologically that address very, very large markets, which we can then fund as a separate division. I don't think it's a substitute for innovation in the core product areas of search, ads, apps, Android, Chrome, YouTube, any of the other areas that we're developing functionality in. I think we do rotate people pretty aggressively across different teams. So there are a number of people from core product areas that have gone to Google X, and there are a number of people in Google X that have come back. But generally, it is treated as a separate area as opposed to under the domain of each of the traditional product areas.
One of the things you discuss in your book is that for a long time, Larry was actually reviewing every job offer that Google made to a prospective candidate. That's pretty remarkable for a CEO, founder, to be doing that. How long did that go on? And I mean, at what point did it stop? Or is he still doing it?
In a form, he still does do it. And when I started initially in 2002, he was literally reviewing the entire packet of every single individual who we hired. Of course, at that point, we were only about 100 people. For a chunk of the next 9 years, I sat on the small team of executives who actually reviewed all of the packets that come through that we make offers to, and we then summarize that content for Larry in a spreadsheet. But in spirit, he is very, very focused on understanding on a weekly basis exactly who we're hiring and the details and characteristics of each of those people, and trying to understand if they remain true to the principles that he set forth from the outset. So he still sees a report of all of the people who we hire each week.
Is that in a Google spreadsheet?
I haven't seen it in a while. I assume it's in a Google spreadsheet.
Of course it's in a Google spreadsheet, Jordan. He probably has all kinds of cool plugins for Google spreadsheets that we don't have yet. So he's looking at things like percentage of PhDs in quantitative sciences and math, or is he looking at something more kind of qualitative?
Well, I think he's actually looking at the individuals historically and making sure that the individuals, adhere to the levels of quality that in the past we have hired. I think Larry has some pretty clear guidelines traditionally in terms of the percentage of people in the company who he'd like to see that are technical engineering or product management types. Historically, I know we targeted as much as 50% of the hires being engineering or product management. I think over time it's dropped a little bit below that, but that was the historical metric that we tried to focus on.
Okay. Now let me ask you, Google is now a very large company, quite mature in many respects, still kind of a dominant force in Silicon Valley, but not the kind of cool, young, hip smaller company that it was, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. With that comes sort of a challenge in that it seems like the company has to evolve its attitude a little bit, has to evolve its approach to hiring, maybe, retaining people. Has there been a cultural shift in Google in the last couple of years along those lines?
I don't think it's fundamentally changed. I just walked across the campus for lunch with a guest from outside of Google who marveled at how fundamentally different the culture and the campus and the company looked from any place that he had been. I think that the biggest challenge that we have is continuing to attract the same kind of quality people that we've attracted in the past. And I think Larry has talked recently about the possibility that we slightly redefine our mission from the mission that we had originally had, because we are attacking some bigger problems than we may have in the past. I think you need to give people the opportunity to attack very, very large problems if you're going to continue to hire the world's best people. And I think that's why you're seeing us do some of the kind of projects that you mentioned before from a Google X perspective, the smart contact lenses, the Project Loon with balloons that are helping give the third world internet access, and wearables and all sorts of other self-driving cars and projects of that nature.
Mm-hmm. These are all really awesome technologies, but one thing that struck me in the book is that you position Google as a challenger to Microsoft. What is the Microsoft strategy, essentially? And now it's reached a point where, to certain people, Google is now the company that you have to be thinking about. What if Google jumps into your space? What if Google starts to come up with this in Google X, for all I know? And so I wonder how things have changed in terms of hiring, knowing that there is a totally different position that Google is in now than it was in 2002 when you joined. There isn't necessarily we're going up against the big boys in Redmond spirit that there was back then. Now you really can hire the top computer scientists, the top designers, the top everything, the top deep learning people. I can tell you that because I love that area. How have things changed in that regard because the company's profile has changed?
I think it's given us more opportunity to get a broader breadth of talent throughout the world. It doesn't feel to me fundamentally like it's changed significantly within Silicon Valley as I look back on the early days of hiring here. When I joined in 2002, it was kind of right after the dot-com bubble had burst, and a very large set of the world's greatest talent had flocked to Silicon Valley, and many of them were looking for jobs in that moment when Google was really one of the few organizations that was hiring. Mm-hmm. What I think we have done more recently is built out a lot of talent in some of these development offices in other places in the world. So, we're now able to hire and harness talent in London, in Zurich, in Tel Aviv, in Asia, in Australia. So we're getting a larger fraction of the world's talent outside of Silicon Valley, but things here feel relatively similar to the way they did several years ago to me.
Okay. Now, are you still working at Google, Jonathan?
I am. I spent most of the last 3 years when I wasn't writing the book acting as the management coach for the Motorola team. Mm-hmm. When I stepped out of the role running products in April of 2011, and we acquired Motorola, or at least we made the offer that was accepted to acquire Motorola in the summer of 2011. So I spent a lot of time helping Dennis Woodside, who was the CEO, mm-hmm. build his management team and then build out a product portfolio over there, and then spent this fall mostly devoted to the book tour. And I'll be trying to decide what to do next within Google over the course of the next couple of months.
Well, that was going to be my next question. What's next for you now that you're done with the book? But I guess you have yet to decide that.
I think I'm most interested in continuing in the mobile space. I think I learned a lot at Motorola working on the hardware side. I think the wearable side is quite fascinating. And I think there's all sorts of opportunities as we sort of manage kind of this grand secular shift from desktop computing to mobile computing that brings up all sorts of exciting opportunities.
Well, it's certainly going to be an interesting few years ahead of us, just as it has been a very interesting decade plus behind us. So, Jonathan, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us on What to Think. To everyone out there who hasn't read it yet, check out How Google Works by Eric Schmidt and Jonathan Rosenberg. Thanks for being with us today, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, guys. My pleasure.
See you later, Jonathan.
Well, thank you for joining us for our podcast, What to Think. As always, you can find us online at VentureBeat.com, where we publish dozens, nay, scores of tech news stories every day. And if you haven't yet subscribed to this podcast in iTunes, please do so. It's awesome. Just search for What to Think on iTunes. Until next week, I'm Dylan Tweeney.
And I'm Jordan Ovett.
We'll catch you next time.
Bye.